Hello students. Today we have a video on lyric and narrative poetry. So first, lyric poetry is poetry that captures an instant of emotion. It focuses on one strong feeling. Uh, Elizabeth Bishop's One Art is mostly a lyric poem because it hinges around the emotion that the speaker is feeling in a specific moment. Lyric poetry may contain more figurative language than narrative poetry, and when I say may, I mean there's a lot of narrative poetry that has a lot of figurative language, and there's some lyric poetry that contains less. And when I'm talking about figurative language, I mean using comparisons, metaphors, and similes, using extensive descriptive imagery, alluding to other works or many other literary devices, and I will bring these up as I talk about the poems in this unit. For example, in the Kominyaka poem, we have the backyard trees breathed like a man running from himself as my brothers backed away from the screen door. So trees don't breathe. So we know already we're giving those trees some personhood. And the phrase like a man running from himself is comparing the trees breathing to a man running from himself. All those things are figurative language. Lyric poetry still has a narrative. It usually still tells a clear story. It always has some kind of narrative. The narrative in a lyric poem is a smaller part of the poem. If you remember, I brought this up when talking about the Kominyaka piece last week. A lot of poetry builds to a climax at the end like a piece of fiction would. All right, now on to narrative poetry. Narrative poetry has a narrative, it tells a story. Almost always has a lyric moment or moment of strong emotion, usually, again, at the end. Narrative poem still is going to use figurative language like the Kominyaka poem does. Often we see poems like the Kominyaka poem that have aspects of both lyric and narrative poetry. So if you have a narrative poem, there's going to be a lyric moment of highest emotion, usually toward the end, where we have more figurative language and sometimes more abstract language. Again, like we saw in use of Kominyaka's poem. So if you know what's going on, if you can see a series of events, a narrative, and you see a moment of strong emotion, you can often figure out what it was that led up to that moment of strong emotion and what that strong emotion is. So, for example, Kominyaka's poem that we read is mainly telling a story about kids who are told by their parents to go play in the yard. They eat some fruit, steal some bird eggs, they watch some dogs frolicking, and then they hear noises from the house, loud as shattered glass in a Saturday night argument about trust and money. They go up to the house and investigate. And at that point, we have a lyric moment. Our speaker doesn't know exactly what's happening. They're too young to understand. But they realized that these cries that they heard fused with gospel on the radio, which they compared to the violence of Saturday night. Those cries are something else entirely. They're realizing where they and their brothers came from. Like, these noises are coming from the bedroom. Our speaker knows that taking a closer look by putting their hands above their eyes like a gambler's visor tells us this is a risk. There's no other reason to bring up gambling at that moment. The brothers are backing away from the screen door and the trees are breathing like a man running from himself. The brothers are backing away from where they came from. They're understanding, okay, this is the origin of life. And we have hints that point us to this. The fruit is how trees reproduce. The bird's eggs, that's birds' reproduction. We have the phrase in there, dogs in June dust and heat. We could read that as June heat, but the phrase is ambiguous. It could be dogs in June dust and dogs in heat. So all of these hints. Also, there is the fact that the speaker very clearly talks about the Saturday night fights about trust and money. But whatever's happening on Sunday afternoons, they don't feel comfortable talking about. They're too young. So Kaminyaka wrote this as an adult, but he wrote it from the perspective of a child. This is what is called a persona poem, where you adopt the persona of someone else and write a poem from their point of view. So the speaker in this poem is a child that Kaminyaka imagined. In your first assignment, which should be online today, you are going to be asked to adopt a persona, take on someone else's perspective, and write events from their point of view. So you are going to have to imagine how someone else sees these events, what they think about them, how they would talk about them. Are they going to be able to speak about them plainly, or are they like Kaminyaka's child in Sunday afternoons? Are they going to, not Kaminyaka's child persona in Sunday afternoons, are they going to have to talk around an issue and not speak about it very clearly? So this is up to you. The bishop poems are online now, so you should be able to read those. And when you do, think about how much of them is narrative, how much is lyric. Think about who the speaker is, who the audience is, and what change you detect in the poem, what shifts for our speaker or for the world. All right, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions.